Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video for the 20th anniversary of the 5th season of Survivor US, I'll be talking about my thoughts on Survivor Thailand, which is a very controversial season that is widely known as one of the worst seasons of all time. And while it has been pretty low on my personal rankings, I've always gotten some entertainment from this season due to the large amount of dark humor that stems from it. But that isn't enough to save this season from its stagnant gameplay, its mostly unlikable cast, and its downright uncomfortable moments that still leave this as one of my least favorite seasons, and one that I was fully expecting my opinions of it to drop to a point where it would have been my least favorite season through this rewatch. But I was surprised to not completely hate my experience rewatching this season, to where my overall opinions of it have mostly stayed the same. Though I can fully understand why most people would absolutely hate this season, while also I can understand the smaller cult fan base that this season has as well. But to run through my thoughts on the entire season, I'll be going episode by episode, starting off with the premiere, which starts with the players walking through a Thai village, with the exception of Rob Z, who's already riding on his skateboard, which is ridiculous. But we then see Jeff give his typical spiel before seeing the players arrive at the shore, where they've now been split up into men versus women, a theme that we would obviously see be executed in the very next season, but for some reason they decided to fake them out here, which I believe was due to some pre-season rumors about the season possibly being men versus women, so maybe they're just playing off of that. But we do get introduced to the cast here, still one by one, with them introducing themselves, stating their name and occupation, during which we get these short shots of them at home, which this is the last season to have these style of intros, which have been commonplace since season 1. But through this we do get a big applause for Ken when he reveals that he is a New York City police officer, with this obviously being filmed under a year after 9/11. Also here we do have Brian Heidick revealing that he's a used car salesman, which, how did he not instantly pick up on the fact that this guy is really sketchy? But later in the episode, he does declare that he's on a business trip, which is obviously a very blatant winner quote there, and really just shows his different approach to the game, where outside of maybe Richard Hatch, it did feel like most people coming into Survivor at this point in time were coming here for the experience and not really being solely focused on winning the game. While Brian's content across the season here almost solely revolves around his game, with him getting so many confessionals across this season, with him detailing how he's approaching the game and his relationships. But then we do get the reveal that the tribes will not be men versus women, but instead we will get the two oldest members of the cast in Jake and Jan to do a schoolyard pick to determine the tribes. The first of very few times this is ever done in Survivor, as production is known nowadays for hating schoolyard picks, seemingly because whenever they do it, it seems to backfire on them, where it doesn't seem like they're ever able to get balanced tribes out of this. And while it doesn't turn out terribly in execution here, the tribe pick itself does go terribly for Chuigan, with Jan picking most of the older members of the cast, while Sukchai ends up being filled up with the younger members. But the concept of a schoolyard pick here has been one that I always liked conceptually on Survivor, as it obviously shows you more of the social dynamics. But for situations that do have like serious game ramifications, I can understand why they don't do this in the modern day, as obviously it's very easily gamed. But I do feel like for situations like picking teams for reward, I do wish they would continue doing this, but for some reason they just leave it up to random chance all the time now. But through this pick, Jan does instantly come off as an interesting character, here with her freaking out when having to pick teams and being terrified about having to be the leader, which instantly makes her likable, but also makes you question why is this type of person on Survivor. But it really seemed like no one wanted to be on Jan's team, including Rob Z, who, when getting picked for Sukchai, gets so excited that he can finally speak and instantly says, "I love you guys, and I haven't even talked to you yet." Which is a fun intro to him, with Rob Z ending up being one of the best pre-merge characters in the history of the show to me. Also, Clay ends up being the last pick guy, to which he declares himself a diamond in the rough, which is certainly a way to describe him. But Clay ends up being noted as the first ever Survivor GOAT, with the claim that he was the first person intentionally dragged to the end for the purpose of being a losing finalist. But despite that reputation and some of his poor gameplay along the way, I do feel like Clay has some solid insights on the game at points, and also almost wins despite being this GOAT. But again, despite Jan's picking of the Chuigan tribe getting criticized here, we do also get a confessional from Ted talking about how they're going to surprise everyone, which clearly foreshadows that they're gonna come out on top despite a rocky start here, with them ending up decimating Sukchai by the end of it. And Sukchai even comes off as pretty incompetent here, with them accidentally rowing their boat backwards, and despite how much they are propped up as this athletic tribe, their camp life ends up being a complete disaster. But here we do see Shii Ann being a narrator for this tribe, and I really liked Shii Ann a lot more on the rewatch here, where in the past I found myself annoyed by Shii Ann. A lot of that stems from her complaining about how much everyone sucks without her doing much better. And I still feel like there's an element of that in her All-Stars run. But on Thailand here, I did find her to be mostly likable, and she ends up being the first player of Asian descent in the history of Survivor, which is insane that it took 5 seasons to get an Asian player here. And outside Dan Lu next season, we don't get another one until Panama, which is insane in itself, but also not another Asian woman until Cook Islands, which is a situation where they were obviously forced to put Asian women on. So this really just shows you the lack of diversity in old school Survivor here. But also Jake gets some great content talking about his tribe, where he instantly brags about how well he picked his tribe, only for him to realize that he picked an enthusiastic crew, but one that doesn't know anything about survival, and says that we have the brawn, but someone else has got to have the brain, which really plays into their tribe dynamic. And I've always loved Jake as a narrator, with him coming off as one of the more likable figures, especially out of the endgamers, though one that I do think is pretty forgotten about at this point in Survivor history. But again, we do get this conflict on what the tribe should focus on, with the majority wanting to focus on the shelter, while the likes of Jed, Steph, and Rob isolate themselves by working on getting food and water, with Jed getting a lot of content here around his instant annoyance with his tribe, to where despite being one of the stronger physical competitors on this cast, he's instantly being set up for being the first boot here. Stephanie Dill also gets a decent amount of content here about how free she is, and we see her go skinny dipping, and this is really the bulk of her positive content on this season, considering she gets sick immediately afterwards, and from that point on she ends up being either dull or really indignant whenever she's on screen. But also here we do see the start of the Rob-Shii Ann rivalry, which ends up being a really humorous storyline across this season, especially with how ridiculously over the top Rob is portrayed here. But I do feel like if Rob hadn't been this big doofusy figure who had brought his skateboard as his luxury item on a sandy beach, this might have come off a bit icky. But again, any scene that Rob is in, I'm just not able to take seriously. And through that, find these scenes a bit more entertaining than what you would normally expect. But here we also see Jake come to Shii Ann's defense, which was a pretty nice scene where she obviously feels ostracized for coming off as different, and is able to console her there. And also her relationships with Jake and Ken seem to be the main reasons why she ends up sticking around as long as she does. But again, despite all of this conflict, Sukchai still ends up winning the first immunity challenge here, which they barely do win, with them being behind the entire way until Ghandia messes up the final puzzle, leading to Jed blowing through it and winning from under their nose, which I always found to be a pretty fun sequence of events that does leave this as a pretty memorable immunity challenge in my eyes. But as for Chuigan, I do find it weird how much this episode revolves around the 3 players that don't make it to the merge from this tribe, with Tanya getting content about feeling like an outcast due to her being the youngest on the tribe and also her being sick. We see Ghandia getting plenty of content, with her also being a really strong narrator early on here, talking about all the camp life scenes, and obviously she ends up blowing the challenge, and also the one to voice her annoyances with a certain other player, that being the eventual first boot in John Raymond, who instantly takes charge of the tribe, leading them during the rowing to the beach. He also ends up leading the search for the water well as well, which I should mention they do make a big deal about the differences between the camps here, with Sukchai having readily available water, but the camp not having a natural shelter, which obviously plays into their drama, while Chuigan gets this massive cave that seems like a massive advantage to not even have to worry about shelter, but the downside is that their water well is only accessible through rowing quite a ways, to which this trek ends up taking up a lot of the episode, but does lead to John's most notable moment here of him finding the water well and deciding to prank the tribe into thinking that this muddy puddle of water right next to it is the water source instead, and this ends up pissing off most of his tribe, being played up as like one of the main reasons he's voted out here, though to be fair, it was probably his more domineering personality that really cost him. But again, this was a pretty fun character moment for him. But we do come into Tribal with it ending up being a blindside for him, though I do want to mention that here we do get a line from Brian that I do find humorous considering future events of him saying it's important to not judge a book by its cover, which is not the mantra that I feel like he follows. But here we do lose John, who ends up being the second guy in a row to be the first boot after 3 older women were the first boots in the first 3 seasons. And John is really the first of these really domineering figures to end up being the first taken out here, which isn't that uncommon moving forward, but considering how much tribe strength played a factor at this point in Survivor, it was still a surprise to see him get taken out before Tanya here, who is sick, and even Ghandia, who messes up the challenge. Which through that does make me think of John as a really bad player here. Contrary to what Jeff says about him at the reunion, to where he really props up John Raymond for some reason. But to go along with that, I do feel like John is probably most known for his really problematic behavior after the show, including his somewhat recent arrest for child cruelty, and that obviously leaves a massive stain on his legacy here as well. Where without the post-show stuff, I do think he would be remembered as this fun one-off character, but instead he's remembered for more icky reasons. But now for episode 2, which starts off with a long segment on Chuigan of Helen and Jan getting lost on their way to the water well, which is largely unimportant, but I did find this to be a fun character piece for Helen, with her having to pick up the slack for Jan and coming back to camp exhausted, through which we do get the start of Clay being this wise ass in confessionals, where he mocks Helen throughout this scene, and later says she has the personality of an encyclopedia, and most of his confessionals across this season are him mocking the players around him in a mean-spirited way. And while I understand that most people find Clay unlikable because of that, and he certainly does say very icky comments at points, which we will get to, but I've always still found him to be a fun character for most of his run because of little moments like this. Obviously, we do continue to see Tanya being sick, to which she's clearly being set up as the boot for this episode, though interestingly, we do see her being pretty close to Brian Heidick, to where he talks about nursing her back to health, and later when voting her out, he says that he's doing this so that she can get better, and calls himself her older brother, which is such a radically different scene than what you would expect, considering Brian's reputation across this season. But then we get to Sukchai, where we get more of the same storylines, with Jed being on the outs. We do see the shelter group finally get around to getting food, but end up doing it all together, which further annoys Jed that grouping always sticks together, which obviously should have been a clear indicator to him that he's in a lot of danger here, with them clearly being close, but he doesn't end up doing anything to better his position here. And we do find out that Jed, Steph, and Rob are also not even sleeping in the shelter in protest, which ends up backfiring on one night where it starts pouring, to which Jed ends up sleeping below the shelter, which annoys some people. But also for some reason, Steph decides to stay out in the rain, which leads to her getting sick, which really dictates the rest of her run here. But despite that, Sukchai ends up winning both the reward and immunity challenges here, leading to Chuigan going to tribal, where we do get an obvious Tanya boot, though we do also see Ghandia wanting to keep her around for a bit, leading to her voting for Helen, but it still ends up being 5-2. And Tanya is a player that I liken to someone like a Jesse Camacho, in where they are largely just a survivor what if on what would have happened had they not gotten sick, as they both seem like players that could have potentially done well across the season, but obviously get voted out early because of their sickness, though I do feel like Tanya probably has more potential in my eyes than Jesse, to where we do see more of her relationships through her being close with Ghandia, also seeming to be close with Brian and Clay, and also the fact that they kept her around over John, despite her already being sick by that point. It does make it seem like she might have had some potential here, but obviously at this point we'll never really know, as it's so unlikely that she'll ever play again. And really most of her content on the season does revolve around her being sick, so not really much to talk about from a character standpoint either. But now for episode 3, which is where we get to the biggest knock against the season, with it starting off with the ickiest moment across what is a very icky season, and that is Grindgate, which really takes up a bulk of this episode and isn't just icky from the actual events that end up occurring here, which in itself are already very unnerving, but also from the way the show portrays these events, which is in a way that has certainly not aged well, making it out to be this fun TV moment instead of the super serious topic that it really is. Also seeming to side against the victim here. And it all starts the night after tribal, where we do get this confessional from Ghandia of her saying that Ted reminds her of her husband, only for us to cut to the morning where now we hear Ghandia saying she feels depressed and used, and later reveals that Ted had grinded on her the previous night and says that it was inappropriate and that he wasn't respecting her marriage. So she obviously goes and confronts Ted, to where he does admit to his wrongdoing, saying that he thought it was his wife and ends up apologizing, to which we do see Ghandia cry over how happy she is that he apologized to her, largely likely due to the fact that she expected him to gaslight her, and for him not to even try here probably made her happy in itself, and this initially does put this to rest. Now, obviously, the fundamental issue is still that Ted did grind against Ghandia, something that shouldn't have happened, something that could be labeled as sexual assault. And while I do believe the part of Ted's story of him thinking it was his wife and it was unintentional, obviously that doesn't matter. It still happened. And it's really something that I do feel like production also takes fault in here in allowing this to happen, to where they definitely could have done more to make sure situations like this don't happen, and really don't even bother to try stopping situations like this until the Dan situation on IOI, to where they finally took it a lot more seriously. But later in the episode, after the reward, which is a very notable reward, which we'll eventually talk about, Ghandia ends up having a change of mind in how she reacts to the apology, and talks about how now she's feeling like a piece of trash, and talks about how Ted was being disingenuous with his apology, and later tells the women about this situation, to which she openly says in confessional that she's embellishing on certain aspects, which the show seems to try to use to villainize Ghandia in this situation, where again, she is the victim. She is the one that was grinded upon. But the show tries to portray this segment in a way that makes it look like Ghandia is being manipulative here, and isn't justified in her changing her mind, and is using this situation to benefit her game, which again is not the way to portray this scene. Now, was she using this story to bond the women against Ted? Yes. But she has every right to do so. But even by bringing this story up, her game's not benefited from this. She ends up having Ted fully turn against her, and him getting the men to do so as well, and she gets this reputation for being this person that's creating a lot of drama. So again, this concept of her manipulating this situation to her benefit in the game is something that simply just doesn't really happen here. She ends up losing social capital by doing so, but again, the show tries to show it as if she's benefiting from all this. But then we get to what is the true icky part of it to me, where we do have Helen telling Brian about this situation, to where he goes to Ted and instantly believes his side of the story, leading to Brian going back to Helen, telling her that Ted said it was nothing, which, to be fair, is not what he actually said, but it does seem like that was Brian's interpretation of it, which ends up turning this into a massive game of telephone, as obviously word gets back to Ghandia, and she's obviously pissed, so she ends up walking out of camp, yells out a primal scream, and starts boxing on a log. And again, the way that the show portrays this scene is making her out to look like this crazy woman, and we get these very icky confessionals from Clay, probably the worst actual content on the show from Clay in my eyes, with him calling this a childish act, and that she's a toddler, that he would have whooped its ass and put it back to bed, which is a terrible confessional in multiple aspects. But again, it's showing Ghandia as if she's in the wrong, instead of focusing on this very complex situation that Ghandia is going through right now. And the show even tries to add a humorous element to all of this, with this all happening with the Red Berets around, which was a visit they had won from the reward, and we have Brian telling them that it's better that they don't understand what's going on here, which is obviously very dark humor, but this was certainly not the time to put a moment like this on the show. And then we get to the actual Ted and Ghandia argument, which makes this all even ickier, where we do get a tribe meeting where Ted really villainizes Ghandia here and saying that for some crazy reason I started grinding on Ghandia, and then follows that up with I'm not even attracted to you, and that I'm 150 to 200% happy with the wife I have now, which, it's a funny line. But again, it's essentially taking us to the point where now Ted's not even really taking responsibility for his actions, where at least with his initial apology, he does put it all on himself. Here, again, he's trying to brush it off. And the worst part of all of this is the fact that Ghandia ends up getting targeted due to this situation. Again, a situation started by him sexually assaulting her, which just really leaves a bad taste in your mouth, not just over this episode, but really the entire season, especially considering Ted makes a deep run on this season. And the players that are complicit in all of this end up being the final five, with the winner and runner-up of the season being the two most gung-ho over targeting Ghandia here. So again, a very, very, very icky situation that would have certainly been tackled differently nowadays, and ickiness does continue into the next episode as well, considering that is when Ghandia is eventually booted. But also something to mention from Chuigan here is that despite Brian's actions here not aging well, the edit still gives him solid content here. Through him talking about the importance of listening and that he needs to keep his cool, like Cool Hand Luke, which are obvious confessionals that play into his winter edit. But despite all this negativity in this episode does also contain what is probably my favorite challenge in the history of Survivor, that being the attack zone, which is a ridiculous series of events here that just make me laugh every time I watch it. Now, the challenge itself, I do find kind of dumb, where the tribes have to transport items from one side of this balance beam course to the other, but for some reason they decide to have one balance beam in particular where between two lines on that beam lies the attack zone, the only spot where you can engage in physical contact. And if you break these rules, the player that broke the rules will be DQ'd and a point will be taken away from that tribe and given to the other, which to me is such a precise rule that it feels weird that they even made it that specific to begin with, but that plays into what makes this challenge pretty fun here, where Sukchai just constantly breaks this rule over and over and over again to the point where Chuigan wins almost entirely from getting points from the other team. And also we see this clear annoyance from Jeff throughout this entire challenge, which I don't know if this is actually true, but I do often credit this with the challenge that starts to push Jeff into narrating the challenges a bit more, where up to this point we rarely see Jeff talk during a challenge unless it's one that obviously necessitates it, but this is one of the first ones where he is a constant presence throughout it. Mind you, that is because he has to constantly call out people for breaking the rules, but even towards the end of this season you start to notice how much he narrates a lot more of the competitions in a similar way to how he does in the modern day, and yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if this challenge played a factor in that. This is also where I should mention that Jeff himself plays such a major factor to me in why I do enjoy this season, where Jeff is just so clearly annoyed throughout the entire filming of this season, to where he gets numerous funny moments across the season showing his annoyance at the players that are out here, with this obviously being one of the examples of that. But again, the main humor from this challenge does come from all of the DQs that occur from it. First, we have Ken pushing Helen while being out of the zone, getting DQ'd there. We have this hilarious and really iconic visual from this challenge of Rob just choking Clay, again, outside of the attack zone as well, to where Jeff has to tell him, you weren't in the attack zone when you grabbed Clay by the throat, which is a humorous line, also leading to Rob calling Clay a whiny baby. We then get Steph facing off against Ted to where she loses, but then she decides to, while in the water, grab Ted's leg and drag him down with her, which also gets a fun, annoyed Jeff reaction there. We then have Jed dashing towards Brian and once again pushing him off before he even touches the attack zone. And this gives us the final really humorous quip from Jeff with him saying, "Come on guys, I'm like a broken record." And really, Jeff's reactions here are such a highlight, and through all these DQs, the score ends up being 9-4, despite the fact that it would have been 8-5 had none of these DQs happen. And again, Chuigan ends up winning here, despite being really far behind, which is just such a great capper to this scene. But now let's talk about Sukchai, where once they return to camp, we do get a funny scene of Rob complaining about Clay, calling him a backwards hick and a whiny punk, and he says that he wants to spit in his face and proceeds to mock the noises he was making when he choked him. And again, this could come off as super icky. Like, this seems extremely dark. But again, it is Rob saying these things, and because that, it does become a humorous line to me instead. And also, we do have Shii Ann following this up by mocking Rob in confessional. And this scene does end with Rob giving this really iconic line of, "We didn't get beat by someone better than us, we got beat by a bunch of rules." So again, this entire scene was just this massive dunking on Rob, which is really fun. But then we continue to see the comedy of errors on Sukchai, where Jed ends up losing the fishing net while taking a nap, leading to Aaron talking about hoping that they're going to lose immunity, which tells you that Sukchai actually ends up throwing this immunity challenge, which largely feels unnecessary to me. Now, for me, I do think there are certainly times where throwing immunity makes sense. We've already seen it in Survivor history, where Ethan takes out Silas after throwing an immunity challenge. But to do it this early in the game, again, it's only the third round here, and also at a point in Survivor history where it's not even guaranteed that you're going to swap. to where you won't have numerous opportunities to do this again, but also the fact that coming into the merge with numbers is such a major factor in this point in Survivor history that to give up all this leverage here to take out one of your strongest competitors in Jed just feels so ridiculous to me, as again, there's going to be a point where they're going to naturally lose anyway. And yes, I know they just saw Marquesas where they did end up swapping after episode 3, but again, why was it so important to take out Jed at this point anyway? But Jed does go home as planned, with the votes of Jed, Steph, and Rob going against Shii Ann, who ends up getting votes at every tribal she ends up attending, in a pretty unprecedented way where it is the same 3 people on the outs voting for her at the first 3 tribals, and at the final tribal, it's literally the rest of her tribe voting against her. So through that, she does have the entire tribe eventually voting against her over the course of 4 different tribals. But let's talk about Jed, who really plays this game all wrong. I mean, having this set way of how he wants the camp to be run and isolating himself due to that, to the point where, despite him being one of the best challenge competitors on this cast, they end up throwing the challenge to get rid of him. So all that's really bad, but considering that he's someone that even by the time the reunion show seemed to have learned his lesson, and I believe he is still a fan to this day, I do think he could be interesting on a return, though obviously that'll never happen. But now for episode 4, which culminates the Ghandia storyline here. Now, Sukchai has a mostly quiet edit here, with most of their content coming at the beginning of the episode, where Steph starts to get more of a focus with her being pissed that Jed was taken out, and she tells her tribe to piss off. She ends up finding some dead squid along the shore and drops it into the pot that they were using to drink water in, which annoys most of the tribe. And she really just comes off super self-righteous here, talking about how she's doing everything for the tribe, and really just takes the place of Jed in the edit until her boot next episode. But again, we do get so much from Chuigan, with us seeing that Ghandia has been ostracized from the tribe, with none of the men talking to her anymore, and Ted even says that she's a bad person for ruining his character, and that he hopes to never see her again, which again, to me, makes him look even worse here. And we do follow that up with more problematic comments from Clay, calling her a problem woman, and that he knew that the moment he saw her, and says that he doesn't feel sorry for her and she needs to fly back to Denver, which the last part of that obviously eventually plays into his vote. But really, most of his comment does come off very racially motivated here, that while we do later see him being called out for being racist towards Ted, we don't actually end up seeing that in the edit here. But this is obviously an indicator that something like that's not out of the realm of possibility. But then we do get to see Helen talk about the situation, where she says that she believes Ghandia over Ted, but she never does anything to support Ghandia in this situation, which I do get the game element of it here, where obviously by siding with Ghandia, she would be causing a tie, to where she would potentially risk going to Rocks, all while still having a strong relationship with Brian at this point. That why risk that over saving Ghandia here? And also just to openly support Ghandia would also put a target on her back as well. But also, it's not like Helen Glover is the most strategic player in the world. So obviously, ideally, I would have liked to see her stand up for Ghandia here, but obviously I get why she doesn't. Now, this is also the episode with the dummy reward challenge that they later reuse for the Gulliver's Travels comp in Nicaragua, where we have them create their own doll, and this ends up leading to the creation of Chui Gal, which I guess is somewhat notable. But also here, Sukchai ends up winning a whole bunch of bananas, which did feel like a weird reward to me, of it being something that you would find natively in Thailand, though to be fair, they do also get chickens as well. But after this challenge, we do get more bashing on Ghandia, and the men just look terrible here, where they get called out for being lazy around camp by the women. And Brian ends up saying that this is the way it should be, for the women to be doing their duties of cooking and cleaning. And obviously this comes off as super misogynistic. But Helen does get good content in calling out Ted and Clay in confessional for this, though interestingly doesn't end up calling out Brian for the same thing. Which, credit to Brian game-wise, but again, on the show, he is the one that is coming off the most openly misogynistic here. But then we do have Sukchai winning immunity, which will be their final immunity win, and in turn, Chuigan's last loss, to where the 5 that end up surviving this round end up being the final 5. With 7 Sukchais in a row going out back to back to back, which is an insane stat, but one that really just shows you the level of stagnant gameplay across this season. But again, the vote does come down to men versus women, with Helen deciding to flip to secure her spot in the game. But during the vote read, we do get another really humorous moment an iconic one from this season where Clay doesn't write down Ghandia's name, but instead writes down Bye Bye Denver Diva, which, I mean, why did he feel the need to write this down? But it is a really humorous scene here of Jeff saying, for the first time ever, I don't know who this vote belongs to. And when he asks for the name, Clay has this brilliant response of Ghandia Denver Diva, as if that's an actual explanation for it. And also we have Jeff clearly being pissed here, saying in the future, write a name down, okay? Enough with the nicknames, which is a humorous way to end this very dark episode. But with that, let's talk about Ghandia, who I grew a further appreciation for on the rewatch here, where you really just feel bad for how she's treated here after revealing to her tribe that Ted had grinded against her. And again, for all this to fall back on Ghandia instead of Ted is really just a Nikki moment for this season. And while I don't know if Ghandia really had that much potential in the grand scheme of things, she did have some fun content in the first couple episodes and did demonstrate a level of gameplay and her trying to get the women together and seemingly being one of the more game savvy of the early boots here. Now jumping to episode 5, where really both sides have an easy boot set up in Jan for Chuigan and Steph for Sukchai, and the gameplay really slows down from this point forward, though on Chuigan we do see the first of Brian's final 2 deals that get shown on the show, in this being his relationship with Ted. And he once again talks about his approach to the game, talking about how much you have to think before you speak, and has a line that's always resonated for me in that you have to be in the majority any way you can, really showing that he's thinking about the amount of options that he's going to have moving forward, looking at the different ways that the tribe can break down and making sure that he's going to be in the majority for all those situations, which I do think is optimal gameplay. And we do see players like Kim and Tony articulate a similar strategy moving forward. Now we do have a little character moment here for Ted and him losing the boat in the fishing net in a similar way to how Jed did, which obviously ends up being way more detrimental for Chuigan considering they need their boat to get water. This leads to the entire tribe being pissed at him. Then we get to another of my personal favorite moments of the season in that Jan gets tree mail to find money in it, meaning that we're getting an auction, the only tribal auction in the history of the show. But again, the scene before it is just really funny to me, where the tribe's out in the water and is asking her what the tree mail said, and she just starts counting the money and yells out American, and the tribe gets annoyed, wanting her to just read the note, all while Clay is giving these really funny glances to the camera. She eventually says it's a gambling thing, and we cut to Clay saying no shit Sherlock, which is a really hilarious moment to me, with this being Clay at his prime in terms of entertainment. But then we get to the auction itself, which surprisingly starts off with an offer to mutiny, which is obviously really interesting considering there were people clearly on the bottom here that would have considered it, though to be fair, if they did end up going through with it, they're obviously just going to be at the bottom of a new group. So there's never really a large incentive in mutinying, especially in a pre-swap situation, but this is obviously its first appearance here, and obviously shows up later in Cook Islands, and also went unaired for Pearl Islands. The moment here is largely forgettable, but the auction here is fine. I did like seeing this different dynamic with it being tribal, but I do feel like it was mostly just a novelty, with the only true great moment to me coming from Chuigan winning nachos, to which Jan is asked what goes with nachos, and Jeff just gets pissed off every time no one knows the answer, to which he reveals it's margaritas, and that's a fun moment. We also get a notable immunity challenge here where it ends up being fish sorting, and Chuigan really dominates here, where despite missing a fish and having to go find it, they still end up winning the challenge here. But again, Steph was the clear boot from Sukchai, though along the way we do get a notable moment for Shii Ann with her eating every part of a chicken that they cooked, which really just shows you the cultural differences between her and the rest of the tribe, which without even another POC on this tribe, it really just highlights the struggle for Shii Ann to bond with the rest of her tribe here, and really just shows the importance of diversity in Survivor, as it does put Shii Ann at a disadvantage here, which obviously does eventually play into her wanting to flip when she gets to the merge. Also, we do get more negative content here for Rob, with him calling Shii Ann's eating habits repulsive, which is something that hasn't aged well. And there's this really humorous scene of him getting stung by a stingray and him having a really overdramatic reaction to it, to where he's acting as if it's a death sentence, and we have Shii Ann mocking him, saying that he's having a temper tantrum. But as for the vote here, there is some minor talk from Aaron about voting out Shii Ann because of her manners, which again, not great. But this leads to Jake once again defending her and consoling her when she starts to cry. And again, gotta love Jake here, but the vote ends up being obvious. Though through it, we do get this iconic Rob confessional with him telling Shii Ann, "Sorry girl, you get onto my nerves and I don't like being around you. Nothing personal," which is just funny. And really a lot of this episode just ends up being super humorous despite not much actually going on in the game. But with that, let's talk about Stephanie, who, again, plays pretty poorly here with her essentially playing the same game as Jed. She also ends up being sick for a lot of her run and ends up being on a bit of a high horse during her last couple episodes. It doesn't make her particularly likable either. And really, as a whole, I just feel like I remember her more for how much production thought she was going to be great TV and how disappointed they were at her being a dud than I do her actual run on the season, which is mostly just filled with her isolating herself in the game and just being mostly negative presence throughout a lot of it. But then we get to episode 6, which really ends up being a fun swan song for Rob Z here. Now, not that much happens on Chuigon here, where we do get this scene of the tribe now having to swim their way to the water spot, where we do get this funny visual that to me exemplifies the entire season of Brian dragging Clay through the water while Ted is left way in the back. We'd also see Jan's pet cemetery segment for the first time, where she finds a baby bat embryo and holds a funeral for it, and that was just kind of weird. But again, we do have Clay looking directly in the camera during this scene and shaking his head, and Brian joking about wishing he could eat it, which is actually just kind of messed up. But again, it really is a scene that is mostly mocking Jan here, despite her coming off as a really kind-hearted person here. But again, Sukchai gets most of the content, starting with Rob asking Penny if she is voting for him, which supposedly he was told this by Ken, which really feels like Ken starting to shift the blame from himself for how the game is going here. And it does lead to Rob finding out that he's been playing both sides, to which Ken gets really insulted that Rob would doubt him, and he says that he's the only person that's been straight up to him and that has been loyal to him, all while obviously being aligned with literally everyone else on the tribe, to where Rob is the next easy target here. So while Rob does approach this argument in a very immature way, as you would expect from Rob, Ken still does come off as pretty hypocritical to me in a way that did kind of remind me of Roddy from Big Brother 3, which just so happened to also be around this time. Then after this, we do see Rob getting in trouble for eating too many bananas, which this talk about banana etiquette is really funny considering obviously it becomes a prominent term in Heroes vs. Villains. We then get an interesting reward challenge, which is the first of these catching balls shot by a slingshot challenge that Rob Z just completely dominates to the point where he gets upset at the rest of his team for not scoring any points, leading to another fight between him and Ken, but they still win reward. And immediately afterwards, we do get this really humorous redemption arc for Rob on his way out, where he talks about appreciating the experience more and that he's squashing the beef with Ken, who tries to give him advice and acts as this older brother figure to him. And he talks about how this has changed his outlook on life, and he talks about wanting to repair his relationship with his dad. And even Shii Ann talks about thinking that he's a nice guy now. And Rob's downfall here was just super sappy and really humorous considering it's the complete opposite of all the content he was given before this episode. And in his actual vote off, we do get a pretty iconic line from him as well, where he tells the tribe it's 2 Bs, guys, 2 Bs. But yeah, let's talk about Rob Z, who is an all-time great character, despite the fact that he's taken out relatively early here. I mean, he has so many fun little moments along the way, all while his behavior throughout the season is just really immature and can be looked at as mean-spirited. But again, I do feel like it is rectified by the fact that you just cannot take Rob Z seriously here. And he's really a large reason of why Sukchai ends up being as interesting as they are, as really a tribe without him and Shii Ann and I guess Jake, it really is a pretty bad tribe. And again, Rob Z plays a major factor in why I don't think this is the worst season of all time. But now for episode 7, which ends up being one of the best episodes of the season, though a controversial one at that, but thankfully this time for game reasons, not ickiness, where this is the episode where we do get the fake merge, which plays out in a really fun way on this season, obviously playing with the players' expectations with how seasons have played out in the past with them merging on day 19. So obviously they were expecting the same thing here, and really I can do with or without it here, where it does end up being this great downfall for Shii Ann. But in the other scenario where Shii Ann ends up flipping, I do feel like that could have been a fun outcome as well. But as a whole, the fake merge is a twist I don't really have that much of an issue with, considering if the players were paying attention, they should have been able to figure it out. But the episode does start off with diving into Shii Ann's rivalry with Penny, where we do see Shii Ann and Ken plotting to take out Penny next, as she leaked the info to Rob. Oh, well, Penny and Aaron are talking about taking out Shii Ann and Ken as well. And with that, Jake ends up being the swing vote here in a position where I do think he would have sided with Shii Ann and Ken, at least based off the content that we've seen on the show. But through that, it would make you think that Shii Ann is actually in a decent spot here, which makes it even more questionable that she does end up flipping at the first opportunity. But then we do get the tribes coming together where players are told to paint themselves, and the players get paired up with someone on the opposite tribe that used the same color of paint, and they get to spend time together, with some of these random pairs being sent out to the camps to decide where to live, during which we do get Ken trying to pull over Helen, but ends up being really ineffective, which is kind of a trend with him. And really just all of the Shukchais, as Brian ends up having such a stranglehold on the Trugon members here. And it's obviously in contrast to Clay trying to flip Shii Ann, to which he ends up flipping her almost right away, with her just instantly leaking all of Shukchai's information to him, which I get that she hated her time on Shukchai. I get that she was ostracized from the likes of Aaron and Penny, but her flipping here is just so bad for her game to be in towards the top of the Shukchai pecking order, only for her wanting to be at the bottom of a 6-person alliance, in a position where you are flipping against your original tribe, and in doing so, never getting their jury votes. So again, this is just such a bad decision in my eyes. That is up there with the Cochrans and the Casses, then making similar moves later on in Survivor history, where you're obviously a singular person flipping over on tribal lines in a position where you end up losing all chance of winning the game at that point. Though obviously it ends up playing out even worse for her here due to it not even being a real merge. Now, Brian and Penny are also paired up, which is really humorous considering the fact that he was literally handed one-on-one time with her, but still doesn't learn a single thing about her, to the point where he ends up losing her jury vote because of it. But then we do get to see Jeff's fake out scene of him telling them that something very different is happening. 2 tribes are living together on one beach. Again, clearly avoiding the usage of the word merge, though without thinking that this is even a possibility. I do think I personally would have noticed his verbiage here as well. But again, it is there, where to me it doesn't come off entirely unfair here. And they do end up living on one beach, which obviously gives us this proto One World-esque twist, which doesn't really add that much to the table here, though I've always liked the concept and thought it could have been interesting if implemented properly in future seasons. But then we get more of Shii Ann bonding with Chuigon, where she does have an interesting conversation with Ted talking about implicit bias, which was interesting to see make air all the way back in 2002. She also plots with Brian about taking out Penny first, which seemed like it would have went through had this not turned out to be a fake merge. But this leads to Brian himself getting a lot of content here of him calling this camp his kingdom, and that Shii Ann is joining his kingdom, telling her that she now has a new family, making him really come off as like this Godfather-esque figure. Now later in the night we do see the players getting drunk, with Jan stumbling around and Brian still playing the game while drunk, where he re-solidifies his final 2 with Ted and tells him to watch out for NYC, which is interesting as referred by Ken at Final Tribal. Ken was told to not trust Ted by Brian, which by knowing that now, it does very much seem like he's trying to pin them against each other here, which could be a good move, but the tactics that he uses on Ken to make this happen are very questionable to me, but obviously we'll talk about that later. Also here we do have Brian talk about his leadership style and how he has positioned himself to know everything that's going on, which by this point in the season, Brian, even edgically to me, should have been a clear frontrunner at this point, with how much insight into his game we're getting here. But then we do get a pretty riveting conversation before the immunity challenge, where Shii Ann goes to Ken, tells him that she's flipping, which he obviously tries to stop her and ends up failing. And I do get what she's thinking here, in that thinking that by telling Ted she's going to be able to keep Ted on her side, but really it just opens it up for him to campaign against her now, and really just sets up her eventual downfall as we get to the immunity challenge, where it's revealed that the tribes are not merged. And Jeff is really smug during this scene, where he said, I didn't give you anything to give you that interpretation. And we do see like Shii Ann's shocked face as she knows she's screwed now, as next time Shukchai goes to tribal, she's instantly going home. And what do you know? They end up losing here. In that tribal, we do see Shii Ann getting called out for flipping, and there really wasn't much she could really do there, though I did like to see her still try. But again, at the point where they all know you're going to flip, obviously you're getting voted out. And for Shii Ann, this ends up being a really fun and notable downfall for her, and that's probably a major reason why she eventually gets her spot on All Stars. And again, I did find Shii Ann to be a lot more likable on the rewatch than I was expecting, where I remembered her being annoying with her just complaining around camp. But I did feel like on the rewatch, a lot of that is really just to undermine Rob Z. She obviously has some great confessionals along the way, probably being the best confessionalist on Sukchai. I did like hearing her talk about the role of cultural differences and implicit bias in the game, and I did feel like she felt like a character ahead of her time, and one that after this rewatch, I would really like to see Shii Ann play the game again, though I don't know how likely that it really is, but I do think she would be much better suited for the modern game. But now for episode 8, which ends up being an extremely dull episode here, and one that really makes the begonging that's about to occur really apparent. But we first start off with Chuigan around the campfire right before Sukchai returns to camp, where they are guessing who's going to be voted out. And here we do see the pinnacle of Brian's social game, where he can't even remember Shii Ann's name, despite, again, the edit really giving him a lot of credit for flipping her over, which I think really just shows you the way that Brian plays the game here, and that he looks at his fellow players not as actual people, but just pawns in his game, to the point where he even says that like Sukchai are his enemies and that they're going to have to earn respect and earn his trust, which really just shows you how misguided he is in handling his relationships with all the Sukchai members, with this playing into him losing 3 of their 4 jury votes against Clay, of all people. But to be fair, Clay does do good work in bonding with Aaron and Penny, though I feel like their appearance definitely played a lot of a factor into that. But Clay does talk about the importance of jury management with the Sukchais here, which is a credit to him, though he doesn't take it far enough with someone like a Jake. We then get a segment about how the Sukchais aren't feeling welcomed, leading to Ken talking about the cave smelling like a urinal. They talk about the men of Chuigan peeing in the cave, which is really just disgusting, that they're peeing in the same area that they are sleeping in. But also we follow this up with Brian once again talking about how the women are domesticated here, and this being back to the good old days of women doing the cooking and cleaning, and again, extremely misogynistic. And this just seems to be very unprompted too, where it's just like all the men sitting by the fire and he just randomly says this. But again, I do feel like it plays into Brian's strategy here of him trying to bond with the men, creating that option for him, but I just really hate how he does it. Because again, he is doing it through utilizing misogyny in the hopes that the other men are also misogynist, so that he can use these misogynistic comments to bond the men together. And he does a similar thing with race as well that we will again talk about later. And it just feels like an icky way to play the game in my eyes that isn't even that effective, where someone like a Ken gets insulted by these tactics, and there's no way that these tactics would be effective in the modern day and would definitely backfire on him if he were to even attempt it. But we do see Brian and Jake bond here over them being the 2 main providers for the tribe, and this is really the only semblance of good jury management Brian does with the Sukchai member, which does lead to Jake initially thinking that he can flip Brian over, which is obviously misguided, and even Ken calls him out for that. But then we get to the final tribal immunity challenge, which means that Sukchai is given one more opportunity to tie the numbers coming into the merge, and instead, cements the begonging here. But I really feel confident that the fact that this was even a tribal challenge here was a last-second change. While I do think the fake merge was always planned, I do suspect that the formal merge was supposed to happen here at 9 instead of 8, but at the last second, the producers decided to go one more round to give the Sukchais a chance to catch back up. As again, it is strange that we get no reward across this episode. The immunity challenge ends up being one that is clearly an individual endurance challenge that they just changed to being one for a tribe by making it based around cumulative time instead, which Brian single-handedly wins the comp for Chuigan here. And with that, we get 4 boring rounds in a row, though it is kind of interesting to see Sukchai now knowing their fate, that they had lost the game, and we do see Jake getting emotional, and we do have this really weird scene of Penny saying that the 4 of them need to sleep together tonight, and Jake says that almost sounds erotic, which, again, a fun little scene there, but also just kind of awkward too. And really the end of this episode ends up being super sappy, with Sukchai now having to vote out one of their own right before the merge, and them agreeing to not tell each other who's going home, which leads to Aaron getting voted out really out of nowhere here with no real explanation on the show. And to be honest, I still don't know really why Aaron gets voted out over Penny or a Ken, especially considering Penny had gotten so much negative content that you would have assumed that she would have been the one to get booted here. But I guess it did seem like Jake had a closer relationship with Penny than Aaron, and Penny was looked at as a stronger competitor than Aaron, so I guess maybe they wanted to keep her around just in case of another challenge. But again, never fully explained why she ends up being booted here, though bizarrely she does become the first jury member, being the first time a jury member was voted out before the formal merge. And Erin is probably one of the more forgettable figures on this season. I mean, I think she was cast to be this like Sarah Jones style of player, but really doesn't end up adding that much to the game or having that many notable character moments. I will say that I was surprised to see her be more prominent in the edit in the pre-merge than Penny, where she does get a decent amount of narrational confessionals, but again, a lot of those are just baseline. And while Penny does become more prominent at the merge, Erin just doesn't, and it's just really just kind of there. But at least that means she doesn't come off as unlikable, unlike a lot of the rest of the cast, though it obviously just isn't super notable either. Now for episode 9, the formal merge episode, which ends up being one of the worst merge episodes in the history of the show to me, largely because of all the suspense of the actual merge is already gone because of the fake merge, and now the Sukjai members are just going to be picked off one by one. But again, we do start once again with Chuigan waiting for Sukjai to return, during which they talk about how no one would have predicted that Chuigan would have been this powerful, which seems to conclude their underdog arc, with them obviously having a straight path to the final 5. Now we do have Jake at least trying to shake things up, though he doesn't ever get any traction here, and technically his attempts to bond with Chuigan end up annoying them instead. Now we do get to the reward challenge, where we learn that they are now merged, and we randomly get videos from home being the reward, with the winner getting their full video, and Brian wins the reward here, and that leads to a really fun moment where Brian warns everyone beforehand about his wife and apologizes for his wife. And we see the video where his wife, Cece, comes off as a massive character here, just dancing around, during which Brian says he's happy she kept her clothes on, but then also gets upset at how she didn't clean the house, which again seems to bleed into his misogyny there. But then we have her showing off his piano and all of his cars, and again, mentioning that she wants him to win so they can use the money to take a vacation to Fiji, which again just really just shows how well off he is, which I do think could have played a bigger factor had he not been up against Clay at the very end. And even Helen mentions that if she wasn't working with him, this would have made him the target for her. And again, it's insane that all these factors that keep on getting brought up about Brian don't lead to people being sketched out by him, which is a credit to him that he's able to get them to ignore all these red flags here. But I do think greatly factors into that just being the group of players that he's working with here. After this, we do get a segment of Ted going off in the boat by himself, which ends up putting a target on his back, though I suspect that the target was already on his back based on things we've heard outside the show. But on the show, it does explain why the votes do get put onto him by the Sukjai members, with Chuigan pretending like they're willing to flip on him here. But here we do also get introduced to Brian and Clay's final 2 finally. Obviously the eventual final 2, one that I'm pretty sure was created way before this, but they do end up being looked at as a pair from this point forward, with Jake doing a lot of work to try to put the target on their backs. In classic Jake fashion, does end up being effective. Now the immunity challenge ends up being a really weird memory comp, that the top 2 of that end up doing a scavenger hunt, which was just a weirdly formatted comp, but it does lead to a Clay versus Ken showdown where Clay surprisingly pulls it out, making Ken the clear target here, though again we do see Jake trying to flip the votes onto Brian, though for some reason he approaches Clay with that, which obviously was never going to work, and Ken easily goes home. And Ken is a player that I think debatably plays the best game out of the Sukjais, where it did seem like him and Jake were the true core, and that his story of being an NYC police officer would help him gain respect if he had been able to make it to the end, to where he probably wins the jury vote. Though even then, I do think Jake is someone that could potentially beat him as well, but Ken is one of these players that I think is a very likely winner had his tribe come into the merge with numbers, though as a TV character, he's probably one of the most boring figures on this cast. The only entertainment that he brings is from his relationships with Rob and Shii Ann, and surprisingly, I believe he was an alternate for Survivor All-Stars, which just feels like a really random choice. Well, that seems to lead into the fact that I guess production kind of liked him, at least the most out of any of the men on this cast. Though obviously at this point we're never going to see him again anyway. Now for episode 10, which starts off with Ted being upset that he was voted for by the Sukjais, to which Jake tells him that they were told to do this by Chuigan, but doesn't explicitly mention who. And through this, Ted doesn't believe anything he says, despite this being a very clear sign that he is on the bottom of Chuigan, which again, credit to Brian that Ted trusts him so much at this point, but again, just another sign for Ted that he should have flipped on Brian here, and just doesn't end up doing so. And Chuigan does use this to villainize Jake, where Ted calls him a snake, as it really gets ostracized from the tribe, though it does also show that Jake is the only person that is actively working against Brian and Clay here, though again, it being Jake ends up being really ineffective, but he does continuously try until his boot. But then we do get to the reward, which is a comp that I do really like, as it does expose some of the tribe dynamics, with there being a point where we have Brian, Clay, and Ted left, and Clay has to choose which one to help over the wall, while the other one is eliminated, and he picks Brian, to which Brian ends up winning reward and takes Clay with him, which again should fully expose to Ted that Brian is more loyal to Clay at this point. And he again mentions it's a possibility, but just doesn't do anything about it. But this does lead to Brian talking about his final twos and saying that he'll pick the one that is better for him down the road, which is a much more inconclusive answer than what you would think it would be. You would think that at this point he would already be fully on board with taking Clay to the end, considering how much Clay is talked about as his first ever Survivor GOAT. But it doesn't really seem like Brian is fully committed to taking Clay until after the events of this round. But again, we do get to see Jake putting in some work with Helen this time, telling her that he clearly sees the pecking order in that it's Brian and Clay going to the end, and that Brian would end up beating her even if she got to the end with him. And she responds with, "I've heard similar things," which really, again, makes you question, why not do anything about it? And even when she thinks about flipping on Brian and Clay, she is talking about taking out Clay, never taking out Brian. And the same thing goes for Ted as well, where again, it really just shows you how little respect Clay had from his original Trugon group, but also just how unwilling they were to turn on Brian. Now, on the return from the reward, we do have Brian and Clay sneaking back food, which nowadays isn't allowed, but here they do it in a pretty savvy move here that Jake calls out himself, of this allowing themselves to look like providers for their tribe and showing their tribe that they can count on them, which I do think plays into why they don't allow it in the modern day. And realistically, it wouldn't matter nowadays if something like this happened, but Thailand had a grouping of players here that were almost entirely very emotional in how they played, and because that a move like this does gain them favor with people like a Helen and a Ted. And then we finally get content around Penny, who does end up going home this episode, but she talks about isolating herself from Jake as a self-preservation move, which I don't think Penny is that good of a player, but it was nice to see her being a player from this era that was willing to play self-interestedly here by turning her back against Jake, which we really hadn't seen done before outside of, I guess, like T-Bird and Frank in Africa. But we do also see her and Clay make a deal where he promises to look out for her, and he does even end up voting with her against Jake here. But it's all a ploy to get her jury vote, which he explicitly says in Confessional, which he is successful in doing. And I guess is probably his best individual move on the season, as again, he gets one vote away from beating Brian Heidick, this player renowned for playing one of the most dominant games in the history of the show. And the fact that he is this effective in trying to undercut Brian's winning chances here, I do think that is a pretty solid move here. It's also a pretty innovative move where, I mean, technically Rich did do a similar thing to Rudy in the Borneo Final 3 of cutting Rudy, expecting Rudy's jury vote. But the idea of sending someone to the jury to vote for you ends up being more effective here for Penny, as she actually does campaign for Clay, much more than Rudy did for Rich. So again, I do think this is a pretty solid move here. Now the immunity ends up being the return of a coconut chop-esque challenge here that, again, I still don't like as an immunity challenge, as it really just hands immunity to one of the majority members. But through this, we do see Penny clearly targeting Jake. But beyond this, Penny did seem like the clear boot, though it initially did seem like Jake was the target at first, until Ted talks about how dangerous Penny is and seems to flip it afterwards. But at Tribal, we do get a bit of a dumb moment where Jake talks about how he shouldn't be voted out because of how much more he's done at camp, which ends up really insulting Clay for some reason. I'm probably obviously because he is one of the people being called out by this statement and the fact that he does nothing around camp. But considering this leads to him fighting with Clay at the beginning of the next episode and fully burning his jury vote in what would have been a very clutch vote to get for Clay, again, a potentially game-winning one, it does make this outlash here even more ridiculous. But again, we do end up losing Penny, who, again, seemed to be a pretty self-interested player while out there, with her letting go of Aaron, her closest ally, and then her separating herself from Jake. So while she is a player that might have been a bit ahead of her time in how she approached the game, I don't really get the sense that she is that good of a player, considering how much she isolated Shii Ann, and the fact that she would have been the merge boot had it not been for the fake merge, and she's kind of just nothing character on the show as well, to where I did not find her particularly notable outside of her final tribal question. But as a whole, she is a mostly forgettable character here. Next up, we have episode 11, which is a very straightforward episode with a very easy Jake boot, though along the way we do get this fight between him and Clay at the beginning. We do also get the family visit here, which they focus a lot on Jake and his wife in a similar way to Pascal and his wife. In Marquesas, though, obviously not as controversial, but this is an interesting comp, as it turns out that the loved ones are the ones competing in a gross food eating comp here, and we do humorously see Cece give up right away, while also talking about how Brian is her soulmate on her way out, which hasn't aged well. But we do also have some humor from like Helen's intense cheering for her husband, who does end up winning here, getting to spend time with her at camp, where we do see Helen's current game view while she's talking to him, with her talking about how Clay is selfish while Brian is someone that plays with integrity, which sure, I guess. But once again, Helen talks about taking out Clay, only for her husband to instantly clock that she needs to take out Brian. Brian is the biggest threat. But again, Helen says she has to do what's right, which has not aged well, as even by the time of the reunion, she is extremely bitter at Brian, talking about never giving her vote at that point. But again, interesting to see how snowed Helen was by Brian at this point in the game. But then we do get to the immunity challenge, where for some reason the family members come back and are team members in this immunity challenge, which we obviously later see them do a similar thing in Vanuatu, and it's a lot more impactful there, where here it's just kind of boring, as Ted wins here, and obviously Jake's going home. But we do see Helen talking to Brian, where she talks about how much she trusts him, and does run through a plan to take out Clay with him by telling Brian that he does nothing around camp, and just constantly shows how little respect she has for Clay, which probably further emboldens Brian to cut her and take Clay to the end, where I do feel like the events of this episode really do make it more apparent to Brian that it is Clay that is the more likely goat here. So I think by this point, Brian for sure knew where he was going. But also, I should mention that this is also the last time that Brian is even vulnerable in the game, as he does end up winning the final 3 immunity challenges, meaning that even if they wanted to take a shot at him, which they didn't, they couldn't, which obviously just shows you even more how locked in Brian was to making it to the final 2 at this point. Though again, a lot of the rockiness from his game, from my point of view, comes from his management of the votes themselves. But as for this round, obviously it ends with Jake getting voted out, and I've always liked Jake on this season. I do feel like he is one of the better players on this cast, particularly on Sukchai, and is one of the only ones to work against Brian throughout the season. And even though he is completely ineffective, I do feel like that mostly has to do with the players that were around him, where I do feel like his style of gameplay would be more effective on a modern day season, and I just found him to be a really likable presence across the season, to where it was really nice to see him supporting Shii Ann on Sukchai and being one of the only people that understood her predicament in the game. And he does have some fun one-liners here and there that does make him a pretty forgotten character that I do look back on pretty fondly. Now for episode 12, where we are finally down to the Chewy Gone 5, and obviously Ted is going home here, based around all the setup that we've had since the merge, that he's been on the bottom, and now we see it obviously go through. But here we do see Brian embracing his villainous side, with him talking about having skating skills, and you have to be ice cold, and have to cut off friendships, and we get this iconic confessional of him declaring himself as Mr. Freeze, which again, it's funny for him to embrace this cutthroat nature and confessional when he doesn't embrace it outside of this in the game, which, to be fair, this is a point in Survivor where that style of gameplay is not respected. But I do think there are certain points where he does come off as really indignant because of his lack of ability to embrace the game that he played. And beyond this, we do end up seeing this awkward conversation between him and Ted, where he does tell Ted that Jan is next, but rarely looks at him along the way, and is also just super cagey here, where he says phrases like, "I would understand if you turned it on me," and that this is all business, which obviously leads to Ted recognizing that Brian is flipping on him. And this was really just poor play from Brian as well to me, where while Ted was always going to flip the votes on Clay instead of Brian in this position, to me it really just shows how terrible of a liar Brian is here, which you would expect him to be better at, considering his style of gameplay, and also considering the fact that he is a used car salesman. But this causes Ted to approach Helen, where they do draw in the sand as they strategize to take out Clay, which Brian and Clay do notice. And Brian, once again, despite him talking about being cutthroat, doesn't ever own up to his game, with him constantly using this scene as an excuse on why he targets Helen and Ted moving forward, which he continues to say that even up until the reunion, where again, he's clearly taking Clay to the end. By this point in the game, he was never taking Helen, and Ted was already on the bottom by this point, so his insistence on this being the moment where everything changed in his mind, and it's their fault for writing in the sand that forced him to vote them out, when again, that's clearly not what happened here. But afterwards, we do get a fun moment of Jeff driving along the beach in a Jeep, to which we get the reveal that this is where we're going to get the car challenge. That has a fun moment at the end of it of Brian finishing the word scramble first, but spelling road trip wrong, giving Ted the answer and the win instead, which continues the car curse here, but also leads to a fun reward, where Ted decides to take Helen, which ends up furthering annoying Brian. And on the reward, we do get Ted, who talks about not being a drinker, but he gets obnoxiously drunk here in a way that is really fun to watch. We have little moments like Ted telling Helen he loves her. We have him yelling while he's taking a shower. He makes these weird noises when he's getting massaged. So I thought this was a little fun scene from Ted. But we do also see him campaign against Clay here, this time with Helen saying that she can get Jan on board, where if they do, they obviously have the votes here to take out Clay, though Jan ends up being really indecisive, and in turn this plan doesn't go through. But even then, I do feel like Helen was always loyal to Brian throughout all of this, and only wanted Clay in particular out here. But we do end up seeing Brian outline his position in the game, where he counts his numbers. He talks about Jan as his trump card that's easily exposable. He calls Helen his loyal, trustworthy soldier, which obviously does not fit into the narrative that he later tries to spin it into. And then he has his friend in Uncle Clay, where he talks about Helen and Clay both being in the game, being a shield for him, with them clearly going against each other. And all this is probably the most intricate awareness of one's game position that we've seen in the show up until this point, which, again, you would expect from someone that plays the first, truly dominant game of Survivor here, but ends up being a game that he is fully aware of pretty much everything that is happening in the game and where he stands, which makes it even more disappointing that he never owns up to it to his fellow players. But the scene does end in a humorous way, where after counting down his numbers, he's left with only his middle finger left up, to which is this humorous visual of him flicking off the camera. But again, the votes play out as expected. And Ted is a tough character to talk about here, where I do feel like for most of his run, he does come off as a somewhat interesting character that does have some fun moments here and there, and is a mostly middling player as well, but obviously his legacy is Grindgate. That is what he's going to be known for in Survivor history, and is a very damning moment for his legacy, and is one that makes it tough seeing him make a deep run here, considering all the ickiness that happened early on. And obviously he ends up getting outplayed by Brian by the end of it in a way that wasn't even that satisfying to watch, with him just being on the bottom for a while without him really knowing about it. And there's even ickiness in itself that leads to him being on the bottom of this tribe. So again, I really just don't know how to assess his run on this season. But now for the finale, which starts with something everyone loves on Survivor, and that is arts and crafts, with them making these floats that are going to be used for the rites of passage. And we also get more of this in the final 3 round as well, where they have to make one for Helen, which, again, boring. But really, this episode doesn't even try to hide the fact that the final 2 is going to be Brian and Clay, with them re-solidifying their deal at the beginning of the episode here. And then Brian once again calls this a business trip, and he proceeds to win Final 4 immunity, making the vote between Helen and Jan, with Brian again now saying that Helen has to go because she tried to work with Ted, which again, I just think is an excuse for him to vote out Helen here in a position where he was always planning on doing so, as obviously he knows that he can beat Jan in final immunity. But first, we do get a humorous scene of Brian going to Jan and telling her that Helen is going, which starts off with him asking her if she knows where the votes are going, and Jan says me, and proceeds to be confused at why he would take out Helen, and Brian directly tells her that now's not your turn, and that making it to 3 is quite a feat, which is essentially telling her that, yeah, I'm voting you out at 3 though, which again is poor play from his end, but it doesn't end up backfiring on him because Jan is Jan. And really, he didn't even need her vote anyway, as this would have easily just been a 2-1-1 if he didn't tell her where to vote. So, I mean, really, all this just felt kind of superfluous. But Brian also makes the decision to not tell Helen here, which I get his rationale, but this ends up being a major sticking point for Helen during Final Tribal. And again, I don't like how Brian acts during this tribal, where he talks about how he hasn't lied, but he has changed his mind. And again, talks about taking out Helen because he's been deceived. And all this would have been terrible play in the modern day from a jury vote perspective. And again, Brian even says when he's voting on his own that, Helen, you caused this effect, which again makes me think he actually believes it at this point. So I really just don't love how he handles the situation. I do think it would have been a sign of lack of game awareness to a modern jury that wouldn't lead to him being respected. Though, to be fair, a lot of that plays into the type of jury that he's working with, which obviously wouldn't respect a more game-heavy approach to this. But with that, let's talk about Helen, who I did find to be a fun character on the rewatch here, with her giving some solid DRs and being one of the more likable figures across this season. That being said, I do think she plays a very scared game, with her not making the moves necessary to get into a winning position, despite so many people telling her exactly what she needs to do. And the fact that she was so loyal to Brian despite being told that she would lose against him is just really bad. But realistically, she was probably the second most likely winner of the Chuigans here, and probably does even beat Brian if she gets to the end. So again, it's not all bad, but like the rest of the cast, she ends up being completely snowed here by Brian, but she still ends up being one of the more likable figures on this cast. And now for the final 3 round, which is just not notable at all. I mean, outside of more Brian blaming everything on Helen, with him talking about how she got lost in her last few days and that she is the sister that went bad. Like, outside of that, it's just boring up until the final immunity challenge. There we do get a pretty iconic one of holding these coins in this traditional Thai stance that looked really difficult. But obviously Brian was going to win it here. And with the choice between Jan and Clay, obviously he votes out Jan. There's no real suspense. And with that, let's talk about Jan, who, again, I just question why she was even there. Now, she is a mostly likable figure, but one that did seem so aloof, that there was a game going on here, never truly doing anything in the game actively, and not even really trying to play the game. But her naivety did lead to some humorous moments here and there, and to be fair, she is kind of a bright spot on what is a very dark season here, and does also probably win the game if she somehow gets to the end, which, I mean, I guess would have to be through final immunity, which she was never winning, but again, if she does, she would have won. So again, as a whole, she definitely feels like an old school casting choice that wouldn't fit in the modern day, but did bring some entertainment along the way here. And now for the final 2, Brian versus Clay, where we head on the final tribal, where we do hear Brian talk about his game once again, saying that the relationships he made weren't real, which is something that is a bit of a shock to hear on a season this far back. Again, furthering his villainous character as being this cold-blooded player, but also mentions that he is worried about being labeled as cutthroat, which, while I do think that's not the best way to come off in old school Survivor, I do think his active avoidance of this label does lead to him not being able to own up to his game at Final Tribal, which would have been detrimental in a modern game, but something I don't think many people talk about Brian's game here is that despite the fact that he plays an extremely dominant game, one of the most dominant games in the history of the show on paper, he doesn't win here because of his dominant game. Like, obviously this is old school Survivor, and this is a cast that in particular didn't care about the game, and most of Brian's votes here do actually come from the fact that he was a hard worker around camp in opposition to Clay, more so than the actual gameplay. And actually the gameplay was the things that they hated about him. Again, this was like a major sticking point for people like a Jan, a Jake, and a Helen. While obviously Ted's is more focused around thinking Clay is a racist, though even then I feel like Brian also has a claim to that title as well. So Brian barely wins this jury vote here, despite all of his strong gameplay to get to this point, where none of the jurors are really thinking about the game in a way that they have to reward the one that played the game the best in terms of the social strategy elements of it, but again are more focused on the survival elements here. But through this, it was interesting to see Clay have decent game awareness coming into Final Tribal, with him knowing that Brian is the front runner, but he talks about hoping that Helen and Ted are essentially bitter, which, again, I don't think anyone articulates the concept of jurors voting against their opposition more so than voting for, which again, I think is a unique concept in Survivor at this point in the history of the show. But then we do get the Final Tribal, which ends up being a really interesting one, with most of the jurors being upset at least one of the 2 finalists here, and both players have really questionable performances here as well. The first point of interest comes from Ken, which is probably the most complex element of this Final Tribal, where he asks Brian to repeat the reason he gave Ken for why they need to take out Ted, which Brian acts oblivious to this, which leads to an incredulous Ken saying, "I know the answer," but he doesn't really push Brian here, and this does lead us to talk about the icky elements of Brian's game, where what he had said is never confirmed on the show. However, from out of the game, we have heard that what Ken is talking about here is that Brian told him that they need to target Ted because they cannot let 2 black people win the game in a row, which is obviously a very blatant racist comment. And no matter how you shake it, this is terrible from Brian. Obviously, if he truly believes this, then that's terrible. But there's also this chance that this comment was purely game. As I mentioned before with the misogynistic comments to the men, clearly part of Brian's strategy here is to bond with people by playing up stereotypes. And what he seemed to assume about Ken was that due to him being a cop, he must be racist. So he tries to bond with him over being racist. And this is such an icky tactic to me. But even beyond that, even as a game move, it's ineffective. He's wrong about Ken, and Ken is insulted by this comment. And through that, he loses Ken's jury vote. And had Ted known the reality of what Brian had said here, I do think there is a chance Ted could flip against Brian. And I think for sure he does not vote for Brian over anybody but Clay. So again, to me, this is just bad on all fronts. I think it really just shows one of the greater flaws in Brian's game in the fact that he plays based off of assumptions and stereotypes. So if he ends up being right, it can be effective. But when he's wrong, which I think it is very likely to be a lot in the modern landscape, it would just easily backfire on him, and he's extremely lucky that it doesn't backfire here. And next up, we do have Penny going up, who once again just dunks on Brian here, asking personal questions about herself, to which he doesn't know the answers to any of them. And to make matters worse, he also gets confused on one of them with Jan's, which pretty much just tells you that he also knows nothing about Jan either, which is a terrible look for him there. All while Clay has a really great response to Penny, which has him earning her vote here, though we do follow this up with Jake, who Clay just brushes off. Now, I don't know if he was ever getting Jake's vote at this point anyway, but he doesn't even bother to try here, which is really underwhelming considering how close he came to winning. But then we get to Ted, who calls Brian a great car salesman. He says, "You sold me your friendship, you sold me your understanding of cultural diversity, and you sold me your word," only to find out that those things were lemons. I always found that to be a pretty fun speech there, but then proceeds to ask Clay if he's ever made a racist comment, which, again, we do not know the comments that Clay made against Ted. Supposedly these are things that he was told by Helen, but obviously Clay denies it, only for Brian to say this wasn't true. And from what I understand, this is another thing we have to talk about with Brian, where another thing he was doing was trying to paint Clay as this racist figure, which again, we don't know for sure if Clay did say statements like this or not, but this is once again Brian utilizing race as a part of the game, using it to demonize Clay and through that get Ted's jury vote here, despite the fact that Brian said very similar things to Ken, which I guess credit him for getting one over on Clay and Ted here, but again, it really just has this very icky feeling to it. And then we wrap this up with Helen, who gives one of my favorite Final Tribal speeches here, where she does call out Brian for not telling her that she was getting voted out after having promised her that it was them three going to the threesome, which was a funny line to me. Also calls Brian the epitome of the trashy used car salesman. And again, Brian just goes off here on it being Helen and Ted's fault that he flipped on them because of them writing in the sand, which again, I do wish he just owned his game more here. I do think it would have worked out better for him, though realistically, it doesn't really end up mattering here. But then we get to Clay, who again, doesn't bother to answer her question, which is ridiculous considering he came into Tribal talking about how he's hoping to get Helen and Ted's votes, and he just throws Helen's away here, which really makes his overall performance very mixed here and having good moments with the Sukchai members, but having really bad moments with Jake and the Chuigan members. But then we do get to the votes where Ted says, "It would have been an easy decision, but you messed up," which I think really just exhibits Brian's game there. But he says that this is a vote against Clay, not for you. Which again, the fact that Brian is essentially winning the game here on anti-Clay votes is pretty sad for someone that played as dominant of a game as he did, really showing you how poor his jury management was. But we do then get another weird fake out where we transition to the reunion, but they try to make it look like it's still at Final Tribal, which is something that they did in Africa as well. Though here you can clearly tell the change here with Clay having clearly gained weight since filming. But again, the votes are red, and Brian wins in a 4-3 vote, which again, the fact that he only won by one vote against Clay is really a knock for me against his game. I know many people say that, oh, he knew he had those 4 votes locked, but did he? He had Jake and Jan for sure, but I do think Helen and Ted were certainly not locks, especially pertaining to the way that he treated them on their way out and through the final tribal. That while yes, he does do active work in undermining Clay to them along the way, their jury votes could have very easily been more anti-Brian than anti-Clay by the end of it, especially considering the fact that you have so little control on what happens at Ponderosa and what info gets spread amongst the players. Like really all the info that was needed to turn the votes against Brian were there. He just gets extremely lucky that all the pieces don't come together. So again, despite the fact that he plays an extremely dominant game and navigating his way to the end, he doesn't have that same level of dominance when it comes to securing the jury votes. And really that's the main season. I do want to briefly mention the reunion, as it is the first one to be hosted by Jeff, in which they do take a more serious approach to how they did the Marquesas reunion, and Jeff himself is fantastic here. It is funny to see, again, how annoyed he is at a lot of this cast. He gets annoyed that everyone wasn't targeting Brian. He openly says how much Clay sucks and that Brian even barely beat him, to which Brian tries to say that Clay is likable, and Jeff is just like, no, which is, again, the type of Jeff that I kind of miss nowadays, of him being very unfiltered on his opinions on players. But then he goes to Clay saying maybe he'll give me an answer, only for him to then scold Clay's answer. Again, all that was funny. He then scolds Jan for playing for third place. He ends up showing Stephanie's audition video, which was bizarre in the fact that it had her stripping, and it ends with Jeff saying a shame that that woman never showed up. And again, all this is just super awkward, but also super funny. But with that, let's talk about the final two, starting with Clay, who, first off, rest in peace, as he did actually pass away in the middle of my rewatch. And again, I do find Clay to be a mostly fun character at points. And at points, he brings a really dark sense of humor to the show. Now, there are also other points where it gets a bit icky through some very questionable comments. But when I think of Survivor Thailand and the entertainment that I get from it, Clay is one of the first people that I think of. Now, as a player, I do think he is a massive mixed bag. Again, he is one that is considered to be the first ever Survivor GOAT, where Brian does drag him to the end, thinking that he's going to have an easy win, only for Clay to surprise him in getting 3 votes there, with those votes mostly coming from the fact that he just treated the Sukjais better. And I think he does do actively good work at points in managing their votes, and he does seem to have a decent strategic mind, but one that is often clouded by emotions. But overall, I don't think Clay is that bad of a player, but one that does have some fatal flaws that would stop him from winning a jury vote in most situations. And now let's talk about the winner in Brian Heidik, who, while I do think he plays a dominant game on paper, the way that he plays the game is in a way that I simply struggle to respect. Again, I don't like the way that he ingrains misogyny and racism into his strategy in the game and uses them as ways to either bond with players or sever the bonds between players. I don't like his approach to jury management, to where he doesn't even bother to try to get to know the Sukjais, and through that doesn't get their jury votes, making his road to a win a lot tougher. But even the votes that he does get, a lot of them are anti-Clay votes, with him also pissing off a lot of those jury members. And again, he doesn't even have the respect from these jury members for the game he plays. Again, it's mostly for his work ethic, and that being the reason why Clay doesn't win here. So while Brian did control the game from beginning to end in terms of his navigation through it, I do still struggle to look at him as a truly elite winner due to how much actively bad work I feel like he does in securing those jury votes. That gets him to a point where he barely even beats Clay of all people at the end. But even beyond the game, I still don't like Brian Heidik as a TV character. Now, I do get the appeal of his cold-blooded attitude in his confessionals, but even those to me come off as extremely smarmy, and obviously mixing that in with his openly misogynistic comments and supposedly made racist ones, and also adding in Brian's reputation outside the show, to where even production has an open dislike of Brian Heidik, to where Jeff himself has mentioned that he feels too disgusted to bring Brian Heidik back. I just found Brian to be an extremely unlikable presence on this show, and a not super entertaining one either. Though obviously that's despite him doing very good work across this season. He does play the first truly dominant game on Survivor US, but the fact that he almost fumbles the ball here, and the fact that I do not think his game translates to the modern day. I do think he is a player that would be doomed on a modern season, even some seasons in the past. Like, I just think that he got the perfect cast for him in Survivor Thailand, and obviously utilized that to the best of his ability, which all credit to him. But I do think when I look at him as a player in the grand scheme of things, I just cannot place him too highly. But there we go. Those are my thoughts on Survivor Thailand 20 years after its initial airing. Again, a season that I didn't necessarily hate on the rewatch here, but it certainly has icky moments and really unlikable figures that do keep it towards the bottom of my personal season ranking. But again, it does have a lot of dark humor elements to it that do propel it from being at the very, very bottom of my list. Now, like my other retrospectives, I will be doing a player ranking for this season down the road, so you can expect that. Also, more retrospectives on the respective anniversaries. Again, obviously the Amazon and Pearl Islands next year, and also just the more general Survivor Big Brother videos down the road as well. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.